So, China's military, often in the West, we kind of think of it like people kind of dismiss it as, a paper tiger or whatnot. But it's actually a very ambitious organization and has a lot of interest in space. Whereas in the U.S., NASA is supposedly more of a civilian organization. We got the Chinese military actively looking into space. And I know you're interested in space law. What's going on?
What's going on? Definitely a lot. When we talk about China, the People's Republic of China, to be specific, because there is that difference with this ongoing political thing about China, about Taiwan and its autonomy, and the People's Republic of China. That's another fracas for another conversation. But fundamentally, when you talk about China, we're talking about not only a different country but a different culture and how they view things. Um, when we think of China, we PRC in particular, we're talking about thousands of years of history. Whereas here in the West, we measure it, well, if we're lucky, in hundreds of years, or maybe close to 1,000 years in the case of Europe. Um, it's definitely a unique country. They are, like I said, different culture, different thoughts on things. But when we think about China in terms of space, they understand they have both a military and political interest, but they also have a cultural connection to it. So when we talk about comparing, say, the U.S. to China, there really, or the PRC, there is no comparison, because they think they look at the world differently in terms of geopolitics, in terms of culture, in terms of how they view space. So let's talk about NASA. NASA is a civilian organization that was created by Congress. But I say civilian in that it's non-military, or supposed to be non-military. However, space in the PRC is all under the People's Liberation Army. The PLA has its tentacles in everything, including space. Now, there is, quote, a non-military organization called the China National Space Administration, CNSA. However, that is basically controlled by the PLA, because it deals with rockets. So when we think of PLA, when we think of the PRC and outer space, understand that there's a strong, really very strong military component to it, as opposed to here in the U.S., where we have NASA and the Department of Defense and the intelligence community that are separate entities and have their own activities in outer space as well.
So when we talk about the PRC's space program is essentially run by the PLA, how does that manifest on a practical level? Like, what are they interested in that, for example, NASA may not be doing?
Well, the PLA is interested in space dominance, or space superiority, what we call space control. In other words, actually being able to not only control having the freedom to do their activities, but also denying an adversary the ability to perform their activities. NASA, on the other hand, its charter is basically dealing with exploration, technology development, uh, things of that sort, and things involving the Earth's biosphere as well. PLA, they're really not interested in that. They're basically interested in military objectives, national security uses of outer space, and how to further China's national interests not only in outer space but on the moon and other celestial bodies.
So NASA's playing Star Trek and China's playing Star Wars.
Well, I guess you could put it that way if you want to use movie acronyms. That's probably an accurate statement.
Well, and I do. But so you talk about it's being controlled by the People's Liberation Army, but China and Russia, they came up with something called the Treaty on the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. So clearly, we can trust China and Russia.
Because they don't want weapons in outer space.
Yeah. They obviously, they don't actually have military.
Because they want to prevent.
Yeah, they want to prevent. The treaty is called the Prevention.
Well, again, they first proposed that treaty, I believe it was in 2008. They amended that treaty in 2014. We're going to shift into space weapons. So a little bit of a history is involved here to understand the geopolitics and diplomacy of space weapons. During the initial formation of the Outer Space Treaty, the two big players were the Soviet Union and the United States. And when they were negotiating this treaty, this Outer Space Treaty, there's this term called peaceful purposes that you find in the treaty. Well, when this being negotiated, the Soviet Union basically said they wanted to use this term called military no militarization of outer space. And you hear that a lot nowadays, and from NGOs. You hear that from the Russians, from the China, from the PRC. No militarization. Now there was back and forth, and finally the U.S. prevailed, and we got peaceful purposes in the Outer Space Treaty itself. So after the treaty was passed, there was this big thing about anti-satellite weapons, with the Soviet Union basically brandishing this idea of, we got to have this ban on ASATs, on space weapons, without even defining what a space weapon was. After the Reagan administration, post SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, when missile defense really became prominent, the focus of space weapons changed to missile defense. Now, what I want listeners to understand here is that when we talk about space weapons, we're really talking about missile defense. As much as they don't downplay it, both the Russian Federation and the Chinese are very concerned about missile defense. And part of the idea of missile defense is to deploy midcourse systems in orbit. And that's where the whole idea of space weapons comes about. If we can diplomatically and work the U.S. into a box where we can get them to ban space weapons, we can basically bring in all these other assets that would actually be used for mid-course defense. Like brilliant pebbles was one thing that was very prominent in the SDI architecture, and it was actually technically feasible at the time, and still technically feasible. Something like that they would classify as a space weapon.
All right. So I have a question about this missile defense. So when I think of missiles, I think of basically essentially rockets that are launched either from the ground or from a ship or something similar. And they might go up quite high, like if it's an ICBM, but they're hitting a ground target, right? So, and then you have, what is this mid-course space thing? Like, how does that interact with a missile?
Well, when an ICBM launches, you have the boost phase, which gets it out of the atmosphere, and then it kicks in. There's another stage that brings it up into what is considered space. It doesn't put it into orbit, but it brings it into space and starts honing in on its target. At that point, it would actually release a warhead or warheads to hone in their target. At that point, this mid-course system would be there to actually interdict those warheads as they were going into, just before they entered what we call a terminal phase. Now, once they enter terminal phase, there's another layer of defense, which you see with like the Aegis system, ground-based systems that would intercept those. But the mid-course would basically be something like brilliant pebbles, an energy weapon that would actually go in and intercept warheads before they had a chance to re-enter the atmosphere.
So currently, are there any of these systems?
Not that we know of, none that have been publicly disclosed. And I say that because there is a very black world out there of special access projects, and we really don't know what they're doing. Another issue with space, the PPWT, understand, is a diplomatic weapon. It's what I call a lawfare weapon. It's there to create chaos and make the U.S. and its allies look bad by basically, we're saying no, we're not going to sign on to this. So it's about making them look bad.
We're talking about the treaty that Russia and China proposed, like
the PPWT. That's the short version.
Okay, so basically, what you're saying is that they either the U.S. agrees or the U.S. refuses, and then it makes the U.S. look bad. But if the U.S. agrees, then there's consequence too, right?
Right. We know there's consequence. We know it's a bad deal. And one of the big problems with it is the definition of space weapons, and I don't have it right here in the PPWT, doesn't cover ground launched missiles. So that's a big problem. I mean, if you're going to exclude those, you still have a ground based. You still have a weapon, an ASAT weapon you could launch from the ground. In fact, these are very common. The PRC demonstrated one back in 2007. Back in 1982, I think it was, the U.S. demonstrated an air-launched version of an ASAT weapon.
So
we demonstrated. Go ahead.
Sorry, an ASAT weapon is what, like anti-satellite weapon?
Anti-satellite. Yes.
So,
well, an anti-satellite weapon is any. I can't define it, but any instrumentality that's used to basically destroy or disable a satellite. This has been there are hard kill, there's soft kill. Hard kill being I run right into it and actually shatter it. Soft kill, I use cyberspace to hack the satellite, or I use lasers to blind it or disable it. There are different layers to what an ASAT weapon is. In other words, it's hard to define a space weapon because there are so many different classifications, and anything could be a space weapon depending on how you use it.
Well, I was going to say, this sounds like it's a problem of definitions, like with, assault weapons. Like there's really no actual definition of what it means, so it can mean anything.
Well, it is. We have this term called dual-use technologies, and and most outer space instrumentalities can be dual-use. For example, we have a ballistic missile defense system that's actually staged aboard cruisers and destroyers that can use their missiles to intercept incoming warheads. However, during a program called Operation Burt Frost back in 2000s during the Bush administration, we had an intelligence gathering satellite that just failed almost immediately until it went into orbit, and it was going to come down. There was a big concern about fuel in the tank might actually spread and contaminate and cause damage. So basically, the U.S. decided we're going to use a ancillary capability of our ballistic missile defense to intercept the satellite before it re-enters the atmosphere, and they did, and it was very successful. They intercepted it on the first try with a missile launched off from an Aegis destroyer. It was extremely, I think either destroyer or cruiser, I can't remember, but it was very successful. And all of a sudden, everybody, the Russians, the PRC, everybody just came out. Oh my God! They just made an aggressive move. They just demonstrated a space weapon, and all hell broke loose. I mean, this is an uncensored podcast, so that's basically what happened. But again, missile defense we demonstrated that missile defense has an ancillary capability for anti-satellite weapons. The Russians did it back in 2021. The Indians demonstrated back in 2019. And so the capability is out there. But you can't ban that weapon. It's hard to ban that weapon because its primary purpose or primary function is for missile defense. Hence, getting back to the whole what I call lawfare action against space weapons, they're trying to defeat missile defense, not space weapons.
Well,